It's time for a Ragnarok build. This is the build that I've been playing the game through, so this is like an early and mid-game build. It's all about offensive potential and status effect usage, so grab your axe, your blades of chaos, and your talking head, and let's go. Quick spoiler check, if you have finished Vanaheim, you should be fine to watch this video except for a couple of minor things you might see in the footage. I won't be showing any footage past your second visit to Vanaheim, so if you're up to there, you'll be completely fine, but let's get stuck in. So my focus for this build, funnily enough, is eeringly similar to my Elden Ring Kratos build that I made last week, and the status effects are expanded significantly in Ragnarok, and it's a critical part of the combat, so I wanted to focus on that and make a offensive build that uses these status effects to great effectiveness by combining them with Extinguished Flames and Vaporized Frost. So when I've applied like Burn on the enemy, switch to the axe to deal like extra damage and vice versa. The armor set that I'm wearing also buffs this even further, and you can grab these skills and this armor set pretty early in the game, so you can melt enemies with this combination. And this is what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to make something that was more offensive orientated rather than trying to buff my defenses or something like that. The Permafrost and the Immolation skills are also really beneficial for this build. It'll help you trigger these status effects much more quickly. Permafrost for the axe and Immolation for the blades is a skill that fills the bar like inside your health bar, and when that bar is full, if you've got the upgraded version, you can trigger it with L1 and triangle to add that element to the weapon and deal extra damage not only from that but also apply the status effect much more easily. So essentially that's the main focus of the build, is just get those status effects on enemies and then switch to the other weapon and melt away at the target. The armor that I'm using is the Manny's set. Now the chest piece for this has a perk that will increase the damage of the Extinguished Flames and Vaporize Frost skills, which is perfect for what we're trying to go for here. And then the gauntlets and the belt will increase the duration of those status effects. So the longer the status effect is applied to the target, the more times you can like trigger those Extinguished Flames and Vaporize Frost skills by actually hitting the target. I've also tinkered a little bit with the Undying Pyres set, and what that does is for Permafrost and Immolation, when that gauge is full, Kratos gains a shield that prevents the first hit taken for resetting the gauge. And I tinkered with that a little bit as like a defensive option, like on some encounters where I've wanted a little bit more defense, as they do have very similar like stat breakdowns from strength, defense, runic, and cooldown. But the Manny set does just become available to you after you have entered Midgard, so you will just be able to get this from the brothers and buy it from them without too much effort, whereas Undying Pyres comes from Muspelheim from doing the challenges there. Moving on to the weapons for like the runic attacks, I'm mostly focusing on damage and the element, whether that be frost or burn. So not so much stun, as stun doesn't really come into this build in any specific way. I'm focusing on the other side of things. So for the axe, I'm using Nord's Tempest, which is one of the runic attacks you get like super early in the game, as well as Ivaldi's Anvil. I like these because they're very quick to get off, and they also apply good damage and frost on the target. I'm using the Stonecutter's knob for my axe attachment currently, which adds a concussive wave to the end of just like the standard attack combos for a little bit of extra damage on top of Extinguished Flames, because we'll often just use like the standard attack combos for those because you can get them off much quicker. So the more attacks you get on the enemy while they're affected by the status, the more damage you'll do. For blades, I'm using the Undying Spark Pommers, which increases the damage of the burn status afflicted on targets. I'm also using the Flames of Anguish light runic attack for the burn that potential that it does do, and Namine Crush for essentially the same reason, like it does good damage and burn, so we can apply those effects really quickly. There's a couple of other like runic attacks that I've tinkered with, but I prefer ones that have a much quicker like animation time to get it off quickly, that have a lot of burn on them. And that's really the general setup here, is using those runic attacks for building those status effects in a really rapid way if possible, and then switching to the other weapon. I'm just going to talk about something here that if you haven't completed the second visit to Svartalheim, you may not want to know this, but it's not a huge spoiler, but I'm just going to point that out so you can skip to the next chapter if you don't want to hear about this. For the spear, I'm using the Attuned Elements handle, which will increase the spear attacks against burning and frost enemies for the exact same reason that we're using pretty much everything for this build. I'm using the Thrust of Thousand Soldiers and the Artillery of the Ancients. I don't really use the runic attacks on the spear very much. I only really switch to it if I absolutely need it, or if there's an enemy that isn't really, effective with the axe or the blades, which does happen occasionally, so I don't use it too much. I mostly just stick to the combination of using the ice and fire of the blades and the axe. Amulet is next. I'm using the Niflheim set for the perk here to increase Kratos' melee damage when he is above 75% health based on his defense, as well as the Vanaheim set to increase the melee damage based on enemies that are status afflicted, because we're going to be applying those status effects a lot, so it just gives you that extra damage bonus. And then because I haven't unlocked the rest of the perks here, I'm just using a couple of others. But the main thing I want to call out here, especially as we talk about rage right now, is the boon of Valor, which will, for the Spartan Rage Valor, it heals less, but it also gives me strength and lifesteal. Now, I am using the Valor Rage mechanic because it does give me health back, and I'm also combining it with the relic that gives me a burst of rage and applies stun to nearby enemies. The main focus is the burst of rage, as I'm using that as like an extra healing mechanic if there isn't like the heal stones on the ground. Because this build is so offensive focused, it's just good to have another way to heal and use that like health benefits if you do absolutely need to, which does happen sometimes. Like if you make a mistake and you do take some damage, it's good to have the variation so that you can heal. Shield wise, I was tinkering with the Shattered Star shield, but I don't know, I don't really like it that much, so I ended up just switching to the parry shield because I find the parry shield just to be the most beneficial to me personally. I'm using the Rod of Absorption to increase the permafrost and immolation skill gauges increase when I block and parry, so I can get those status effects off much quicker because then I can build that effect off and get that off and just keep doing more damage. In terms of skills using, I've probably touched on the main skills that I'm using, though I do really like Scorch Sweep, which I have touched on in other videos because it is a great skill for the Chaos Blades to build up that status effect very rapidly. And for the axe, I do use a little bit of the Glacial Rake and stuff like that to build those status effects when I'm not using the runic attacks, because runic attacks will get you those status effects pretty quickly, and then if you combo it with a couple of those like special skills like the Scorch Sweep or the Glacial Rake or something like that, then you can trigger the status effect and switch to the other weapon. For the skill mods though, I do use a lot of damage and the element. They're the two main ones that I'll focus on, because damage is, you know, great just to have in general, but if I can't get element, then I'll use damage. But element's the main one because for the most part I want to be building those elements to trigger those status effects as quickly as possible. So the skill mods that I have used are mostly just element and then damage if I can't get that, but you could use something else. Like I've tinkered a little bit with momentum, and maybe I'll do something around that, like in an endgame build, which I will have an endgame build coming out probably later this week, so keep an eye on the channel for that. Generally, playing this build comes down to a couple of things. I start most fights with the axe, and I'll often just trigger like Frost Awaken on the axe, so that initial attack will build up some of that frost element. Then I'll use like the runic attacks or combo into that, potentially permafrost, depending on how quickly I can build that up and get that to trigger. Once I have triggered the frost status effect, I'll switch to the blades and essentially just swing away. It's also worth noting here that you're better off using the normal combos for the increased damage, like when you're using the frost or the burn status and trying to get those effects off, because you can attack quicker than if you're using something else. And the runic effects don't trigger the extinguished flames and vaporized frost skills, or it doesn't seem to increase the damage that much. And because you often are just like wasting that status effect by in the animation, it's much better just to swing away and then like rinse repeat as you switch between weapons. Some enemies will have resistances to one of the elements, so sometimes try the other one. It is hard to know that because it doesn't really make it clear, but in some cases, like if you're trying to build that status effect, it's not really occurring, switch to the other weapon and try that, and it will often build up much quicker. So it does require some experimentation, especially on like bosses and bigger enemies, as you're trying to figure out, like obviously the burning enemies are going to be resistant to fire, right? But sometimes you got to try and figure that out, and it's not always rightly clear. And because this is an offensive build, you're going to want to get good at parrying or dodging, you know, those kind of avoiding damage when it is coming towards you, because you won't really have a good way to heal if you do take damage other than just using the Valor Rage that we talked about earlier. So I will have like a tank, like defense build come out. I just wanted to show you guys the build that I'm using at the moment as I'm like playing through the game. So this is like an early mid-game kind of build, and we'll do some more advanced stuff a little bit later on. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.